Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is David Cohn. I'm Executive Director of Public Affairs here at the Union League Club of Chicago. And on behalf of the officers, directors, and members of our club, it is my privilege to welcome you to this evening's program, which we are very proud to present in partnership with the Stigler Center. I want to say that tonight's program is meaningful to me on both a personal and a professional level. On the personal level, because I spent most of my adult life working for a member of Congress from Illinois, Congressman John Edward Porter, who was deeply involved in the nurturing and sustaining of the democratic institutions that were created following World War II to try and tamp down fascism and to promote the rule of law, democratic principles, and free international commerce. And it's been disturbing to me and to many in this room, I'm sure, to see the degradation and the erosion of many of these multilateral institutions over the last number of years. So tonight's program could not be more meaningful to me or more timely for all of us in that context. For the Union League Club of Chicago, I wanted to mention briefly a little bit about the history of this place and why it is so appropriate that we gather here tonight to hear from Yascha and his colleagues. This club is the descendant of a movement that arose during the American Civil War in 1862, to be precise, called the Union Leagues of America. It was a movement of citizen patriots dedicated to do whatever they could to assist President Lincoln in the defense of the Union. That's where the Union and the Union League Club name comes from. This volunteer movement spread throughout the northern states, and at the height of the war in 1864, counted more than 1.2 million Americans among its ranks. They provided funds, ammunition, clothing, medical supplies, whatever they could to help the Union Army and what they perceived as a threat to the democratic institutions and to the Union, to the nation itself. And much as those patriots saw a threat to democracy and a threat to the United States of America posed by the Civil War, Yascha, in his writings and his lectures, has drawn our attention to the threats posed to the democratic institutions and the democratic principles that we thought were so well entrenched. And so we thank you and we welcome you to this evening's program. The Union League Club for the last 139 years has been convening conversations and presentations such as this, where we gather together to reason together and to hear from those who can give us some food for thought and perhaps some inspiration for action. So we thank you for being with us. You honor us with your presence, and we are delighted to partner with the Stigler Center, and we thank them for this opportunity. And now, to continue our program without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce and to ask you to join me in a warm welcome for the director of the Stigler Center, Mr. Simone Cavallaro.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dave, and thank you all for coming. I also want to thank the Union League Club of Chicago for hosting us. We are delighted to partner with you for tonight's event. We are very happy to host Yascha Mounk for a conversation on his latest book, The People versus Democracy, moderated by Katherine Waldock and Luigi Zingales. Yascha's book is available for sale in the back, and he will be happy to sign copies at the end of the program. This is an especially exciting event for us because for the first time, we will be recording the conversation for an episode of the Stigler Center podcast, Capitalisn't. The podcast, co-hosted by Kate and Luigi, was first released in January. Please check it out and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on the record and video recording the event, so please silence your phones. As usual, the views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. As you may know, the Stigler Center promotes and diffuses research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. We have many initiatives, so please check our website for full details. Also, if you'd like to support our work with a donation, we would be very grateful. There is one particular event that I'd like to highlight. On November 12, we will host a conversation on short selling and corporate fraud with Fahmi Kadir, a young woman who manages her own short-only hedge fund and made a name for herself by successfully shorting Valiant Pharma stock amid a bull market. Back to tonight. We look forward to an insightful conversation which couldn't be more pertinent given the current political climate. Yascha is a lecturer on government at Harvard, senior fellow at New America's Political Reform Program, and host of the Good Fight podcast. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other news outlets, and has published several books. Kate is an assistant professor of finance at McDonald School of Business at Georgetown and holds a courtesy joint appointment with the Georgetown Law Center. Luigi is the Robert McCormack Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance and the Charles Harper Faculty Fellow at Chicago Booth. He is also the Faculty Director of the Stigler Center. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thanks, Simone. We rolling?
Yes.
All right, so as has been mentioned, this is a live podcast episode. We're recording, so if you don't like anything we say and you want to get up and start screaming, you're going to be on our episode. So you should know that.
That sounds like enticement.
Yeah, I know, maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that. We're going to start with our regular podcast introduction. Hi, I'm Kate Waldock from Georgetown University.
And I'm Luigi Zingales from the University of Chicago.
You're listening to Capitalisn't, a podcast about what's working in capitalism today.
And most importantly, what isn't.
We are thrilled to have on our podcast today Yascha Mounk, who is a lecturer at Harvard, a senior fellow at New America, an executive director at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and the host of the Good Fight podcast, which I highly recommend. So welcome, Yascha.
Thank you very much.
This is also our first live podcast episode. I am personally terrified. You can't feel my palms right now, but they are just dripping with sweat. Luigi, you're probably used to this. Are you terrified?
I'm not terrified, no.
That's what I thought.
But what about me? Nobody's asking me if I'm terrified.
I just assume that you're good at this. You're probably out talking out your books all the time.
I don't know. We'll see.
Anyway, well, when I asked if I could get you a drink, you asked for Diet Coke, but I got you this Pilsner, which I think is a German beer to make you feel
there
welcome.
seems to be a sort of American microbrew version of it, but it's perfectly drinkable. Yeah,
And it's also,
nice.
it's like representative of you, kind of, right?
By the way, do you feel German, American, British? What do you feel?
Some of the above.
All right, that's a diplomatic answer.
Well, I grew up in Germany. I obviously have a connection to that country, but I've been living in the United States for 11, 12 years at this point, and I think this is where I'm going to spend, hopefully, the rest of my life, unless political developments force me to flee. So I feel pretty American, pretty connected to this place. I became a citizen a few months after Donald Trump became the president of the United States.
In celebration?
Not in celebration. Well, in celebration of the values which I think he threatens. And because I was looking forward to swearing to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
But you had to also swear allegiance to him, no?
No, I don't think
No,
that's
not
not how
to
it
the
works.
president?
That's not. He wants you to think that. He wants you to think that the FBI and the army and so on owe allegiance to him, that they owe the allegiance to the Constitution. Very happy to swear my allegiance to that. What about you, Luigi?
I'm still only an Italian citizen.
How come?
Because I served in the army, it was mandatory at the time, and I had to swear allegiance to the Italian Constitution. And it's hard to swear allegiance to two places at the same time.
All right, so we're here to talk about your book entitled The People versus Democracy, maybe more aptly titled Saving Liberal Democracy. So to make sure we're all on the same page, can you start out by telling us about what exactly is liberal democracy and why is it worth saving?
Sure. We usually just talk about democracy. And so we sort of try to associate everything we like with democracy. But I think the problem is that when you expand one word so much that all of the good things sort of fall under it, you can't draw careful conceptual distinctions anymore, and you can't actually understand what's going on in the world anymore. So I think it's worth remembering that our political system is twofold. It's a liberal democracy, which doesn't have anything to do, obviously, with a sort of more political way in which we use the word liberal. So in the way in which I'm talking about George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan are about as liberal as Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, right? So this is not liberal conservative. But what it means is that there's two basic values which our political system tries to instantiate. The first is individual freedom, that we ourselves decide what to say or not say, that we ourselves decide which God to worship or whether to worship at all, but we decide how to lead our lives. And in order to have that, we don't just need protections for various unpopular minorities, we also need the rule of law and the separation of powers. Because if the president or prime minister can say, hey, I don't like what you just said, I'm going to throw you in prison, you're not going to be free. So that is the liberal element of our political system. And then the second is the democratic element, that we want to collectively make our decisions together, that there isn't a monarch or a military general or a priest who tells us what kind of laws we should have and where we should take our polity. It's all of us deciding those things together. So to me, liberal democracy simply means a political system that strives and to some extent succeeds in instantiating these two basic values.
Your book is also called People versus Democracy, as if there is a opposition between the two. Maybe it's because I wasted 5 years of my young life in learning ancient Greek, but democracy comes from demos, people. So what is this tension? And you seem to, you said that the notion of democracy expands everything that is good. You seem to dump into populism everything that is bad. So, if I may say, there is a bit of a populistic interpretation of the word populism.
Well, I have no idea what that means, but I'm sure you'll explain it to me down the line.
Luigi thought it was a cute thing to say.
Yeah, this is sort of like a little bit like, French cultural radio. It's like, you have somebody on who's written a book about the fear of death, and the moderator asks, isn't the real problem the fear of death? That we'll get back to that. The first part of the question I understood. So why is the people versus democracy? What does that mean? Well, I mean two things by that. One is relatively straightforward. One is a little bit more deeper, perhaps. So the straightforward bit is that back in the years in which everybody thought that democracies in places like Italy and the United States was obviously consolidated and obviously safe, and there obviously wasn't any particular reason to worry about it, I was a little skeptical of that narrative because I saw lots of data points out there in the world point to various forms of trouble. The fact that people had very low trust in institutions, that governments were really unpopular, that participation in elections kept going down, that especially in Europe, membership in political parties kept falling. And so taking all of those things together, I thought that seems like reason to worry. But most social scientists at the time, meaning 3 years ago, didn't agree with me. And they drew this basic distinction between what they called government legitimacy and what they call regime legitimacy. So they said, yeah, people are getting more critical of particular governments, but that's a good thing, that's healthy. That just means that they're becoming more sort of ambitious, that they demand more from the political system. That's actually healthy, they're becoming critical citizens. Regime legitimacy, the actual attachment to the political system, is as deep as it has always been. And so I started to look at questions in surveys that actually got specifically at regime legitimacy. And what I found is that regime legitimacy has been going down in very worrying ways quite rapidly. So in the United States, for example, when you ask older people born in the 1930s and 1940s how important it is to them to live in a democracy, over 2/3 say absolutely important, 10 out of 10. Once you get to younger Americans born since 1980, relatively young Americans, less than, thanks for that slide, Shaka.
When were you born?
1982.
See?
Exactly. Less than 1/3 of those say that it's absolutely essential to live in a democracy.
So it's all Kate's fault.
What?
It's all Kate's fault as a millennial.
We're both born since
Yeah,
1980.
it's our fault.
Well, we're on the right side of that, I assume. I don't want to presume your political views, but hopefully you think it's... Anyway, so that's one thing. But there's lots of other data points, right? So even when you ask about as extreme an alternative to democracy like army rule, 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that was a good idea. and now it's 1 in 6. Among young and affluent Americans, it's actually gone from 6% to 35%. So that's one obvious sense of the people versus democracy. The people, it turns out, are sort of turning against democracy. A majority still likes it in some kind of general way, but they don't have a commitment to it that they once did. There's also a deeper sense for it, which is important to understand, I think. So, if you have these two core elements of our political system, liberalism and democracy, my fear is that these two things have been starting to come apart. And that on the one hand, for a long time, we've had what I'd call rights without democracy, undemocratic liberalism. So a political system that's reasonably good, not perfect, but reasonably good at ensuring individual rights, the rule of law, but that doesn't do a great job of actually translating popular views into public policies. And then on the other hand, you have the rise of what I would call illiberal democracy, or democracy without rights. A bunch of populists, we'll get to that, a bunch of populists who come in and basically say the only reason why we have political problems is that this corrupt elite that wants to serve itself, or is in cahoots with those sort of minorities and outsiders and so on. And what we got to do is for somebody like me who really speaks for ordinary people to come in. I alone am the true voice of the people, so just give me a little bit of more power, trust me a little bit, and I'm going to fix everything. And what happens over the long run, as we've seen in countries like Hungary over the last 8 or 9 years, is that this person, first of all, establishes an illiberal democracy, which is to say that they scapegoat various minorities and restrict their rights and so on. But once they have also attacked liberal institutions, once they have also put their own loyalists on the Supreme Court, once they have replaced the independence of law enforcement communities, once they have taken over state broadcasters and made it very difficult for private media outlets to do their job, once they control the Electoral Commission, it no longer is possible to replace a democratically elected government through democratic means. So at that point, the champion of the people, the populist who claims to speak for the people, who initially might have been very popular, actually turns against democracy, and illiberal democracy slides into straight-out dictatorship. But since he claims to represent the people, that's the idea of a populist, and since people have actually voted him into office, this is the sort of deeper sense in which the people turn against democracy.
Okay, let me try and reformulate Luigi's question then. I wasn't clear in your book what exactly populism meant, and in particular, I mean, the examples that you gave were, for the most part, far-right populists. Mm-hmm. What about people on the far left? So, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, would you consider them populists?
So there are absolutely left-wing populists. I want to distinguish between two meanings of populism, right? So sometimes in America we just mean the sort of 19th century agrarian populists and so on. That's not the way in which I use the term, right? I mean, the way in which internationally people use populists is a kind of style of politics, a kind of rhetoric of politics. And it's precisely the claim to an exclusive representation of the people. That I stand for the real people, and by definition, everybody who disagrees with me does not. Everybody who disagrees with me is illegitimate. And once you do that, you're not going to accept the kinds of independent institutions we need to preserve liberal democracy over time. You're not going to accept that you pass some law and the Supreme Court decides that it's unconstitutional, that you commit a crime and the police might investigate you for it. That seems illegitimate to those kinds of populists. So that means that it's not defined by public policy. If you just look at public policy, then populists seem not to have very much in common with each other. You may have noticed, for example, that our dear president, Donald Trump, does not appear to be, let's say, overly fond of Muslims. When you look at somebody like Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, he does not appear to be overly fond of anybody who's not a Muslim. There are some populists, like Donald Trump actually in certain ways, who at least in their actions are relatively right-wing on the economy, right? Giving tax cuts to billionaires and actually cutting some of the welfare state. There's others, like Hugo Chavez, who are very left-wing on the economy. So that's not what defines somebody as a populist. What defines them as a populist is a rhetoric in which they say the whole political system is broken and needs to be replaced. I alone truly represent the people, and there's no real legitimate limits on my power. And absolutely, people like Hugo Chavez, who are left-wing because their economic policy is left-wing, fall into that, and that's why I call them populists.
But when somebody say I'm the 99%, I'm the people, so Bernie Sanders said I represent the 99%. Why is not a populist?
Well, what he's saying is that he is standing for the economic interests of 99% of the US population. I don't particularly like that slogan for a number of reasons. For one, because if you actually want to do something about economic inequality in this country, it's not just against the 1% that you have to go, but actually it's the top 10, 20, 25% who have huge advantages over the rest of the population. So as an actual prescription to the kinds of policies you need if you're serious about remedying economic inequality in this country, I find that slogan quite unhelpful. But I don't see anything in Bernie Sanders' rhetoric which goes beyond that, which actually says, I'm going to shut down media outlets. I think it's unacceptable for people in the media to criticize me. I think that anybody who disagrees with me isn't a true American. Those are all things that Donald Trump does all of the time, and those are all things that Hugo Chavez did all of the time. I haven't seen Bernie Sanders do those things, and so that's why I wouldn't call him a populist on my terms.
And what about Tsipras or Podemos?
I think you're getting closer there. Certainly in the case of Tsipras, we've seen real attacks on the freedom of the press, for example. Editors of a newspaper just recently being arrested because they attacked or they wrote critically about the finance minister. I think in that case there was a magazine that was closed down for criticizing the defense minister at an earlier point. So you're starting to see that. But let's talk about your country for a moment, Luigi. Proudly your country, since you don't want to become an American. So you're not one of us. How can you explain why in Greece Tsipras is managing to rule with ANEL, a far-right populist party? And how can we explain that in Italy, the Five Star Movement, which very much has its roots on the political left, even if now it's more politically amorphous, is able so far to be in a relatively stable government with the League, which is a far-right party? If you just look at the policy proposals, if you just look at where they come from on a left-right spectrum, this doesn't make any sense. But when you look at the fact that they're both populists, that the main driving force behind them is precisely this deep opposition to the existing political system and the claim that you're either with us or you're against us, then I think it starts to make sense. It's the only way we can explain how these forces have ended up in coalitions and have ended up making it work.
Actually, in Italy, it's very simple. It's because the only other alternative was to have a coalition with the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party, run by Renzi, said never, ever. They prefer to be in bed with Berlusconi than to run with the Five Star. So the Five Star had no alternative except this one. So it was really, I think, the contempt of the traditional left that forced the Five Star into the hands of the League, with a disaster for the Five Star itself and the country.
But perhaps that's what explains how they ended up in that coalition. For, by the way, as you know, the Democratic Party and Five Star together would not have had a majority in the Senate. So
they will.
It wasn't
they will.
Not in the Senate.
Also in the Senate, if Renzi voted in favor. Renzi said, over my dead body, I control enough senators.
Do we have a fact checker here? My understanding is that they didn't have a majority in the Senate together. But anyway, we can debate that another time. But that might explain how they wound up in bed together. Mm-hmm. It doesn't explain why they're still in bed together and why
after
things
2
seem
months.
to be going rather well. Well, that's a long time for an Italian government.
That's
By
true.
the way, it's been half a year. So I'm about to publish a study with a colleague, Jordan Kyle, which shows that, don't quote this anywhere, I say to the tens of thousands of people to listen to this podcast, hundreds of thousands perhaps.
Do you claim that?
I don't know. I don't mean to. No. So the study is going to show that, contrary to some expectations, it's not true that populist governments tend to be less stable or in government for less long than ordinary governments, quote unquote. In fact, they're in government for about twice as long as others on average, which is really striking and shocking. Of course, that means that in the case of a particular government we've been discussing, we can expect it to be in government for about 24 months.
But let's go back to the term populist. Again, you see everything negative, but even in the history of the United States, of course, Andrew Jackson had a lot of defects, but it did represent some change for the first time, somebody not from the landed gentry became president, and the existing elite was indeed very corrupt. The people who were supporting the Second Bank of the United States were on the payroll, while in Parliament, on the payroll of the Second Bank of the United States. So, and the United States survived after Andrew Jackson. So you have this view that if you have a populist president, necessarily you drift into the disaster. But at least if you look at the US history, and Italian and German history is very different, but if you look at the US history, it seems to be pretty positive.
Well, first of all, perhaps if you like Andrew Jackson so much, who of course is the favorite president of our current president, you should rethink whether you do want to swear allegiance to him or not. Look, I mean, the best way of looking at that is comparatively. And obviously, it's not easy to destroy a democracy, and there's plenty of cases where populists failed to do that. But on average, they do tremendous damage to democracies. Less than 50% of the time, a populist who is elected in democratic elections is removed from office through free and fair elections, less than 50% of the time. We see that if you want to look at times in which democracy is damaged by a democratically elected government rather than a foreign invasion or something like that, it is 14 times more likely to happen because you've elected a populist into office than any other kind of government. And when you look at many countries around the world, you see that economically, at the beginning, it can work relatively well because the populists tend to be a little bit more immune from ordinary sort of constraints of politics, and that can lead them to have effective management in the short run. But in the long run, they tend to fail to modernize their economies. They tend to rely very strongly on short-term economic performance through fossil fuel sales and so on. And they tend to hugely overspend. And so in very many cases, 10 or so years into the rule, you get utter economic disaster, as we're seeing at the moment everywhere from Venezuela to Turkey and so on. So sure, you can cherry pick one particular example and say, well, there's plenty of bad there, but perhaps there are some good things too. When you look at it systematically, it becomes very obvious that these governments do real damage.
Well, I'll add in another example, which, to be fair, was not the president of the United States, but I think that the McCarthy era was also a period of populism in the sense that McCarthy was bringing to trials people who were considered outsiders and communists, people who worked in the entertainment industry, people who were homosexual, and doing serious damage to their reputations and to their careers. But that movement, to some extent, was diminished, if not completely eradicated, by due process and the rule of law. There were a number of Supreme Court cases that ruled against their unfair methods that pushed people back in the direction of the established rule of order. And I think that there are positive and optimistic lessons to be learned there, in the sense that we can do the same thing now. For example, Trump was at his lowest point of popularity when the Supreme Court, or not necessarily the Supreme Court, but a number of courts were ruling against his travel ban. And now I think we're making progress in terms of going after his emoluments or his financial interests. And there's a case, I think DC and Maryland have sued him for emoluments, and that's progressing. And I think a few months before that, the same case was dismissed. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that I thought you were a little overly pessimistic about the use of the rule of law to overturn populism when there have been examples, including here in the US, of cases in which due process has made headway in overcoming populism.
So first of all, I just want to note that the line of attack on me has now shifted, which is good. I want all the lines of attack. So it's no longer
we were going to play good cop, bad cop? Because that's not how this is going to work.
No, it's bad cop, but that's
exactly.
fine. Welcome to Chicago.
I'm not from Chicago.
So the first line of attack was that populism might actually be good. Now, apparently, at least for the moment, we've conceded that populism is bad, and the question is, but can't we beat it in the end? Yeah. And look, I mean, 3 years ago, I was going around to people trying to persuade them that our democracy may be under some amount of real threat because of the rise of populism around the world and various things that worried me in the United States. And people, to put it politely, looked at me like I was crazy. They kept calling me Cassandra, by the way, and I always wanted to say, but Cassandra was right, damn it. And so, you know, my argument is not that we're doomed. My argument is not that there's nothing we can do to defend our institutions, or that, you know, I'm swearing to you that 2 years from now we'll all be living under Generalissimo Donald Trump. My argument is that there's a serious danger, and that when you look at the best historical analogies we have available, and they're imperfect, but the best we have, there's very real reason to be concerned that often populists prove to be more effective in government and to do much more damage to the institutions than elites tend to think. Who think, well, that guy, well, he's not going to beat us. What on earth are you talking about? So to get to the question, you know, I think some American institutions have been holding up, others have not. It's striking to me to what extent the Republican Party has become a willing tool of Donald Trump's latest whim. Whatever, you know, whenever he says jump and whichever hoop he holds out to them, they try to not just jump through, but jump above and do a little pirouette whilst they're at it. That's very concerning to me. People did not predict that 2 or 3 years ago. When you look at the extent to which he's already managed to bring the FBI to heel, that's very concerning. He has at this moment managed to fire the director of the FBI, the deputy director of the FBI, and 3 really leading instructing agents and so on. When you look at the investigation to Brett Kavanaugh, I think there's real questions about whether that political context helped to limit what the FBI actually investigated. And I don't think it is any longer impossible to believe that Rod Rosenstein will be removed, and that the last sort of checks on how the FBI does its work are gone, and that in 2020, for example, you might have a politically motivated prosecution of a Democratic presidential candidate. I'm not saying that's sure to happen, but I don't think it's unimaginable anymore. When you look at the Supreme Court, I'm starting to worry as well that there is a deeper rot there than I would have anticipated 2 or 3 years ago. That's partially because of the decisions we've seen over the course of the past year, in which, congressional maps, where there was evidence on email that they were used to weaken the Democratic Party and discriminate against African Americans, were ruled to be constitutional, where a highly dubious voter purge in Ohio was ruled to be constitutional. So those business as usual a year ago. Now we have a stronger conservative majority on the court under circumstances where the pretense of nonpartisanship has gone out of the window in a really striking way during the Kavanaugh hearings, and in which the nature of conservative partisanship has ceased being commitment to a set of values and has started to be loyalty to one person. And so you take all of that together, and it worries me. At the same time, you're right that certainly the media continue to be very active, and that in part because we have such a decentralized country, elections for now remain not entirely fair because of all of the problems of gerrymandering and so on and so forth, but certainly robustly free. And so if the midterms go as some of the polls at least predict, and Democrats manage to regain control of at least one of the branches of government, and if Democrats run a sensible candidate in 2020 and manage to remove Donald Trump from office, then yes, I think there's a very good chance that we survive this kind of populist movement, at least in the short run. But we are in danger, and we need to recognize that, because otherwise we're blind to the stakes we face.
But your defense of the liberal democratic system is a defense in principle or because of outcome? Do you think that we should look at the principle or the outcome? Because you participated in the panel of the Brookings a few months ago, where there was William Galston, who is a political scientist at Brookings, and part of the Clinton administration back then. And he said about an outcome of primaries, said primaries used to be less democratic, but if there is less democracy in name of better outcome, I'm all for it. So I was a bit struck by somebody who calls himself democratic. They say, but actually I prefer a good outcome rather than a democratic outcome. Where do you stand in that spectrum?
Well, I mean, I think sort of exactly how much democracy you have within our system is, you can have open debate about, right? I mean, obviously, you want, in a real way, to have a political system that translates popular views into public policies. And I think our system hasn't done that sufficiently, and that's a real problem. Now, the exact institutional arrangements for doing that in an effective manner are open to debate. And by the way, I'm currently reviewing a book that's arguing that precisely putting people in real control of candidate selection is ultimately a bad way for average people to have their preferences realized. So there may be an argument of limiting the depth of democracy in party candidate selection precisely because it actually, on average, improves the representativeness of candidates down the line. I actually don't buy that, and I'm going to criticize the book in various ways, but there's a serious argument to be made there that isn't trivial, but I think we should take seriously. Now, on the substantive question, no, I'm in it because I believe in the ideals. Because for all of the flaws of liberal democracy, I think that as long as you have your basic material needs met, and as long as you have basic safety and security, which I think are the things that motivate human beings the most, and in situations where that is absent, they don't care about free speech, and they don't care about all of those other things, they just care about having something to eat and being physically safe. But once we've achieved that, as thankfully in our society by and large we have, I do think that the most important thing to me is giving people the ability to lead their lives in a self-determined way, and for us together to be in charge of our fate. And I still retain the hope that that is deeply motivating on ordinary people as well. Now, at the same time, I'm also cognizant of the fact that we need decent economic and other outcomes to keep people loyal to the system over time. And one of the reasons why I think so many people are starting to turn against democracy is that they don't feel that. So as long as things were going great, and living in a liberal democracy not only meant that you could pay lip service to all of those wonderful ideals, but it also meant that you got to live in the richest country in the world and have a wonderful lifestyle and all of those kinds of things, it was easy for people to pretend or to tell themselves that the real reason why we care about democracy is all of those high-minded ideals. But I think when we're looking around and feeling like, you know what, it's not obvious right now that living in a democracy is a better economic bet than living in a non-democratic system. And actually, I haven't felt any real economic progress in a very long time, then they become quite tempted by alternatives to democracy. And so I care about outcomes as well, in part because I think that we need decent, in part because they matter. It matters that people have a decent standard of living. And in part because I think we need to deliver for people in those concrete outcome legitimacy type ways in order to make sure that the ideals that I really care about, like individual freedom and collective self-determination, remain viable.
But so you're willing to sacrifice a bit of democracy for better outcomes, like Galston? So
That's not what I said.
In the context, what?
That's not what I said.
I'm asking, and it says, is this in the context of primaries? So the primaries in the old days were made in smoke-filled room, and now are much more open. Now, in old days, Donald Trump would never have been elected, never nominated as a Republican candidate, let alone being elected. So are you willing to take a little bit more democracy with the risk that comes in, or you want to restrict democracy to have it more, to a better outcome to be defined? Where are you on this trade-off?
I don't think the trade-off is as simple as you're saying. I mean, the thing about the primaries at the moment is that they end up, so, what percentage of Americans participates in primaries? Something around 10%. Depends obviously on the particular election, often a lot less. So is that truly democratic if 10% of the population choose who the candidates are? And if they end up choosing people who are deeply unpopular in the rest of the country? I don't think it's trivially true that that's the most democratic system. So I think that we should go for the system of candidate selection that actually winds up producing candidates who represent the views of a lot of Americans. And institutionally, there's, I think, plausible arguments to be made about different kinds of setups. Now, I think in the United States, it's not really realistic to get rid of primaries, which is one of the problems I have with this book I've been reviewing. So I don't think there's sort of a lot of point discussing it in great detail. But I don't see it as this principled trade-off. I think the goal is to have candidates who are representative of the views of people, but it's not at all obvious that primaries are such a better way of producing that than some other potential systems, which perhaps have the involvement of fewer people, or perhaps they have involvement of more people. I mean, one solution is we somehow manage to get 50% of the US population or 80% of the US population to participate in primaries. And then they really would be democratic. And we're not capable of doing that, then perhaps the best outcome is to have people who are already office holders and who therefore already have some kind of democratic legitimacy by a different path make some of the selections. But right now we basically have the most partisan people in the country making the choice. And it's not clear to me that that's a great system.
You say in your book something along the lines of populists give one sentence answers to complex questions, and that's why people like them, because a 3-sentence answer to a complex question is too much. I feel like you just give a 12-sentence answer to a complex question, and I'm a little lost. So maybe to restate the same question a third time, what do you think about, like, for example, a state referendum?
I mean, it depends on what kind of political culture that's embedded and so on. I think it's quite clear that in California it's been a disaster, in part because you can have referendums to limit how you raise money, or you can have referendums to enforce that you spend money on particular things, but those decisions are made without context. I mean, everybody.
So what is the evidence? Sorry, what is the evidence in California as a disaster? The referendum?
Well, certainly.
Or referendums, depending on.
The country has a 25-year budget crisis, in which it spends 4 times as much on its criminal justice system as on its educational system.
But could you say that people feel like they have more civic spirit because they can?
They just passed a referendum to increase their taxes by a majority. So it's not true that people don't vote in favor of tax increases. And actually,
well, they did for 25 years, and as a result, the public education system in California is in a very serious crisis.
But you have massive participation. That's the will of the people. Why you are against them? Why not more referendums? That's a way to bring people to participate actively, make decisions, and have an influence. That's what they want. This debate about populists is they want to participate more. Why don't we take them literally and we give them a higher voice in the final decision by voting more on substantive issue, or having law of popular initiatives in the United States, except at the federal level, has worked very well. In Switzerland, it's worked wonderfully. Even in Italy, it works well. In the sense, we have resolved the issue of abortion that you in the United States have not resolved yet. And we voted, a Catholic country voted in 1978, a majority decided, we move on. You're still fighting the Supreme Court for something that could be resolved very easily with a referendum.
How is it working in the United Kingdom?
That was a silly referendum because did not have a clear alternative.
Damn.
And also, you don't base
but now,
on...
So now you're distinguishing between referenda, right?
No,
What
no.
I was trying to say, in which you sort of, just took me to task for, is that it really depends on the kind of context you have. That if you have, if you ask people, everybody knows this, right? If you ask people in polls, do you want universal health care? Yes. Do you want higher spending on schools? Yes. Do you want higher spending on the military? Yes. I mean, you ask them, do you want higher taxes? They say no.
That's
right?
not
so
true.
What
California proves the opposite.
No, that is true if you look at actual polls. So what you have to do is to present people
That's the difference
with
between
sensible
polls and elections.
You ask me a question, let me answer. You have to look at people, you have to give people an actual structured choice. And there's some political systems that use referendums in a way where that becomes feasible, and perhaps there's even more innovations we can think about with digital technology and so on, where that becomes possible. Certainly, I think forms of e-participatory budgeting, where it's about a municipal budget that people can understand, and it's either a separate pool of money, which they can allocate to different projects, or they can see sort of it in the context of how much the minimum is that the fire department says it needs and so on. That might make sense. But I think if you have a system where the referenda are just selected by a random issue that gets 100,000 signatures, and then you can make decisions about that without the political system framing it as a trade-off with the other kinds of goods, I do think it often ends up in a disaster. Now, the other thing, of course, is that often referenda will sacrifice the rights of unpopular minorities. Perhaps that's a price to pay for democracy, but we should at least acknowledge the high price. And the obvious example there, for example, is in Switzerland, where a few years ago, 58% of the population decided to ban the building of minarets. So that the Swiss constitution now reads, and I quote, "There's freedom of religion in Switzerland, full stop. The building of minarets is forbidden, full stop." Now, I'm not saying that's a once and for all argument against referenda, but it certainly demonstrates that often popular majorities can be deeply illiberal, can curtail the rights of minorities in deeply troubling ways. And that's one of the effects of a system in which what referenda can be about is not in any way constrained.
But representative democracy can be illiberal as well. Look at France. You cannot go on the beach with a burkini because why? Because they voted that is illegal. That's crazy.
That's actually untrue.
Is that true?
It was the mayor of Nice that passed this, and within 2 months it was overruled by a nice anti-democratic institution, which is the Cour de Cassation.
But you cannot go with a cross or a Jewish symbol in a public place clearly shown because this is forbidden in France.
You can absolutely go with those things in a public place. Have you been to France, Luigi?
I've been to France. I came back from Paris the other day. So
there's limitations on what you can wear in public schools.
Yeah.
There are no limitations on what you can wear in public schools.
Isn't that a democracy that imposed limitation on expression of religion in a public place? That's pretty strong. So I think that this has nothing to do with referendum, not referendum. If you want to have a constitution that protects minority, can protect with referendums, and can protect with a representative democracy. And if you don't, you can have an illiberal democracy everywhere. I don't think it's unique to referenda.
All right, I'm going to call time out. We've gotten through about a quarter of the interesting topics that we wanted to talk about, and we are already over time. So can we briefly talk about some of the solutions that you propose in your book?
Sure. Should I just
You can just
expand?
start wherever you want.
All right,
You've got about 40 seconds, so.
Well, the problem is that I didn't get to talk about what I think the causes of this moment are. So it's a little hard to talk about solutions without having talked about what I think has caused this political moment.
20 seconds each.
All right, let's see. Look, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that wherever I go, people tell these very local stories about what went wrong in their particular countries. And since we see the rise of populism across lots of different countries, I think we have to look for causes which are shared. Now, I don't think there's any one cause that's exactly the case in the same shape everywhere, but there's a cluster of 4 or 5 causes, and a subsection of them, I think, is jointly sufficient to see the rise of populism. So anywhere where you see 3 or 4 of those 5 or 6 causes, you wind up with strong populist movements. The 3 most important ones that I focus on in the book is a stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens. After, in the United States, from 1945 to 1960, the living standard of an average American doubles. From 1960 to 1985, it doubles again. Since 1985, it's been roughly stagnant. The same in Europe. You had the Trente Glorieuses in France, the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany, these 20, 30-year periods at the inception of democracy in many countries, in which the living standard of people just fundamentally transformed. And now, for the last 30 or so years, people don't feel like they're getting something out of a political system that fundamentally transforms what they think about politics, how they trust their political system. The second big topic is culture, immigration, race. So most democracies in the world, upon the founding, had a sort of mono-ethnic, monocultural conception of themselves. They said, somebody who truly belongs in our country is somebody whose ancestors also came from this place, and they certainly are not from any ethnic minorities. They certainly do not come from other continents, and so on and so forth. That has started to change over the last 40 or 50 years. There's some real change in those self-conceptions, but there's a big part of the population that isn't on board with those changes and that rebels against it. And the United States and Canada on that are both sort of similar and different. They're similar in the sense that they're different in the sense that they've always been countries of immigration. They've always been multi-ethnic societies in a certain kind of way. But they're similar in the sense that they had a very clear racial and religious hierarchy, which gave a lot of advantages to one group over others. Here too, we've actually come a long way in overcoming that, but we certainly haven't overcome it completely, and there's a lot of people who are rebelling against the relative amount of equality that we've managed to achieve. And then the third thing to me is the rise of digital technology, of the internet and of social media, which makes it harder for political and financial elites to control the Overton window, to control what can be said in politics. And that can be a positive thing. It can allow important, formerly marginal voices to enter the political fray, but it can also be quite dangerous when it allows people who want to spread racial hatred, people who want to spread straightforwardly false information, to have a much bigger voice in our political discourse, particularly at a moment when people are already economically frustrated and a part of the population already is fearful of demographic and cultural change. Do I have another 20 seconds?
No, I'll give you 3.
All right, that's very generous of you. So I think we need to confront those basic drivers. So I think we need to have an economy that ensures that the fruits from economic growth and globalization actually go to ordinary citizens in a way that they currently don't, but that also tries to accelerate productivity and economic growth, because we've seen that that's one of the big reasons why living standards have stagnated. I think on the cultural piece, we should resist the temptation that a lot of people on the left have, and that I had for a long time in my life, of trying to leave patriotism and nationalism behind in the 20th century, which it so cruelly shaped. If we do that, we ignore the fact that nationalism has tremendous force in the world, but it, as the last 20 years have shown, remains the most powerful political motivator in most of our societies, and allow the political right and the worst parts of the political right to dominate and exploit that motivating power. And so instead I advocate fighting for an inclusive notion of patriotism, in which we don't leave that camp to the Steves, Bannon and Miller and so on, but fight to appropriate it for ourselves, arguing that actually nationalism historically has been a way of expanding the circle of human sympathy beyond our own village, our own family, our own ethnicity, our own religion, so we can feel real solidarity with people who might be 1,000 miles away from us, who might have a different skin color, who might have a different religion, but who we recognize as our fellow citizens. And finally, on social media and the internet, I don't think the solution is to censor, as some European governments are now doing. I think the solution is actually, in a serious way, to fight for our political values. From Plato to Aristotle, from Rousseau to the Founding Fathers, each set of political thinkers who thought seriously about how to make a self-governing republic work emphasized the importance of passing our values on from one generation to the next. I don't think we take that seriously in the way we educate our children. I don't think we take that seriously in primary and middle schools and high schools around the country. And I certainly don't think we take that seriously as one of the core tasks that university professors and academics like us here on the stage have to do every day. And I think if we change that, hopefully it'll make a little bit of a difference.
It's missing from here the failure of the elite. Generally, populism arises, and we see now in Brazil with Bolsonaro winning 47% of the votes at the first round. Why you have this rise in Brazil, part of it is the economic failure, but part of it is the elite was deeply corrupt. And in the West, we had a major failure, like a war in Iraq that was fought for no reason, for misleading leaders that misled the American and the British people into a war that was a disaster, and I don't use swear words, but you understand what kind of disaster. We had a financial crisis. We had no executive going to jail in spite of massive fraud after the financial crisis. We have an opioid crisis in the United States that is pushed very much by an industry that wants to make money on the face of people and is protected throughout the way. And I can keep going.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, and I do talk about it in the book if you've read it. This is if you put beers on the stage, then you got to expect the shots to be fired.
This is why I put it on the stage.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, one of the things that I say is that, when you look at the 2016 election, I think there was a choice between a moderate politics of a status quo and an extremist politics of change. And so if people voted for Donald Trump, it's not necessarily that all Americans are extremists, or even that 46% or whatever voted for him are extremists, is that they really want to change. And the best way to fight against that is to create a plausible vision of how we can have quite radical change, of how we can actually shake up our political system and reform some of the ways in which it's not delivering for people, but without being ideologically extreme, without giving up on the basic founding values of our country and the basic founding ideals of liberal democracy. So that's the project I try to pursue.
Actually, I did read the book. I didn't find any suggestion of what to do on that front. So not suggestion of the failure of Obama to put people in jail, the failure of Tony Blair to conduct a terrible war, and I can keep going. All this failure not being analyzed. There is not really an attempt to change radically against an establishment that has failed. I think that there should be a recognition that there was a major failure, and if there is not a recognition, I think the other side will win. It's like in Brazil. I don't think most people want somebody like Bolsonaro, is that the elite that is there is a disaster.
I mean, I think you also need to be a little careful about not equating everybody to each other. When you look at someone like Barack Obama, he certainly didn't achieve as much as he promised in 2008, in part because there was very staunch opposition from Republicans for him to do anything, and they made the first order of business making sure that he wouldn't have any successes. But he did manage to take the country from the brink of economic and financial catastrophe, get the economy going again, actually increase in an imperfect manner the welfare state in a moment of economic crisis. So absolutely there's deep failings of the elites, and there's ways in which establishment political parties have to become much less complacent than they are and than they were. But I think if you sort of say that everywhere you look it's disaster, I don't think that's quite fair. And I don't think that people did look at the presidency of Barack Obama and think it was a disaster. In fact, he was extremely popular on the day of the election in 2016, and he's even more popular now. So yes, we need to change, and this is something that I speak very clearly about in the book. But we also shouldn't sort of start talking like populists, which is something I believe you said I did early on, and say that everything is a disaster and there's nothing at all that we can be proud of.
No, there are certainly things we should be proud of, but there's a lot of things to change. And on this, I think we change who asked the question. And we.
Well, I get to weigh in too. I'm a little nervous about sharing my opinions because you might also accuse me of not having read the book. So I'm going to start with some nice things. I think I appreciate your policy prescriptions related to redistribution, and particularly about curtailing the incidence of tax havens. So thumbs up on those. I thought what was missing a little bit, and you did include a discussion of this, but what was missing a little bit was that given that you think that part of the problem is people voting, so engaging in the democratic system, but voting against liberal ideals, and also part of the problem is millennials who've never really been exposed to fascism, supporting autocracies or authoritarian regimes, I would have expected more of a discussion about ways to reform the educational system. And some of the solutions that you had were like including digital technology in education and making education more touchy-feely in a way that like there's one-to-one relationships between teachers and students. But I thought that that was a little highbrowed because some of the problems that we face with education are that we can't afford to heat our schools in the winter, and we can't afford to pay our teachers more than like poverty-level wages. And there seemed to be a disconnect between some of the educational solutions that you propose and the reality of education in the United States, and I thought that that was particularly important.
So I do, I mean, by the way, you clearly have read the book, thank you very much. This is, of the many events I've done about the book, the first time I've been asked about that particular section, so I appreciate it. I do talk, though, about the utter scandal in the United States of the fact that your school district determines the funding for your school. It's not true in the aggregate. I know there's an unpopular thing to say. Teachers are great. Teachers rule. Teachers are the best. Okay, now I'm allowed to say what I'm going to say. which is that actually on average, teacher
it's kind
salaries...
of like saying no offense, but...
I know, it makes it more offensive. But
Exactly.
On average, teacher salaries in the United States are among the very highest in the OSCE. We don't have a problem with teacher pay on average. We have a problem with teacher pay in very poor districts. And that's because of a screwed up way that we finance our schools.
We should talk more about educational financing.
Sorry?
I didn't see enough about educational financing.
Okay, I could have written more about it, but I do say that it's utterly unacceptable that this is what we're doing. But in every other country, obviously there's still much better schools and much worse public schools in Germany and Sweden and France as well, but the basic level of funding does not depend on whether they're in a bad part of town or a good part of town, or whether they're in town or in the suburbs nearby. In the United States, I went to public school in Germany throughout my education, and when I heard what friends of mine in the United States had done in high school, the kinds of opportunities they had in public high schools, I was blown away. We didn't have anything like that. If you go to a public high school in a nice suburb somewhere in the United States, the quality of that education is vastly superior to the best public school in Germany. But if you go to a school 5 miles down the line, it is vastly inferior to the worst public high school in Germany or France and so on. And so to me, that is an obvious problem in the United States that has to be fixed. And I say that in the book. Perhaps I could have said it 2 or 3 times instead, but we don't disagree.
All right.
So time for questions. We had great fun talking to you. We'd like to share some of this fun with the audience here. So there are microphones around, so if you raise your hands, and yes, over there.
Hi. So I have sort of 2 questions. The first one is a methodological point, right? So I sort of got to know your work through the deconsolidation survey stuff. And that seems to be the primary evidence that things are getting worse, right?
It's not at this point, but...
other than the election of, I guess, Trump, which was essentially a statistical toss-up. But so how do you, and I say this as a psychologist, but how do you actually interpret when people say something like, I'm in favor of army rule, right? There's a sort of, it's unclear what people are actually saying, and I say this as someone interested in perceptions, right? So not like as an adversary. The sort of second one that builds off this data point is just, when you talk about deconsolidation, it sort of makes it appear as if there was a time when things were consolidated, right? But an examination of, at least for American history, it was being illiberal to different degrees from the internment program to J. Edgar Hoover, who couldn't be fired, to the Church Commission, where we didn't know what the CIA was doing or the NSA was doing, to the secret wiretaps. I mean, when was it consolidated? Right? When was the good era that we could go back to?
So a few points. First, it's not the only piece of evidence. I mean, when you look at electoral results around the world, we're talking a day after Jair Bolsonaro became the very likely next president in Brazil by coming very close to the 50% mark in the first round of presidential elections there, about 20% ahead of the next placed candidate. You just have to look at election results around the world to see the rise of those kinds of authoritarian populists. In Europe, the average vote share for authoritarian populist parties in 2000 was 8%. At the beginning of this year, it was about 25%. Now it's closer to 27%. You can now, if you remember Winston Churchill's famous line of an iron curtain descending across Europe from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, you can now drive along that iron curtain and never leave a country ruled by authoritarian populists. And then you can continue on to the west to Bari or to the east of Athens and not leave a country like that either. And we are seeing all of this translate into worse outcomes. So for the last 13 years, there's been a democratic recession in which in each and every year, more countries have moved away from democracy than have moved towards it. So there's lots of evidence to go on beyond those surveys. Now, when it comes to those surveys, look, I agree that those are difficult to interpret and that we shouldn't take them too literally. So, would the 36%, 35% of young affluent people who say that they like the idea of army rule actually cheer if the colonels came out tomorrow? No. Would they enjoy over time living under military dictatorship? Definitely not. Few people end up doing that. What it does show, though, is the sense of people always talk about democracy, but I really don't know that this is working for me, and so, I'm not really worried about somebody who really wants to destroy the system in certain ways. How much do I have to lose? Let's try something new. How bad could things get? Now, we know from history, and we know from looking around the world today and looking at Turkey and Russia and Venezuela and many other countries, how bad things can get. And so when many more people say, yes, army rule is a good system of government, no, it's not important to me to live in a democracy, when many more people say that now than did so 20 years ago, whatever exactly they mean by that, it can't be good. And I think it's a good reason to worry about it. Now, the third question is important. I'm not saying that things are much worse today than they were 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. I think on most metrics, things in the United States are better today than they were 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. And the main reason for that is that despite many challenges, we've actually moved towards much greater racial, sexual, and so on equality. I mean, there's no question in my mind, but it's better to be a member of just about any minority today. Perhaps 2 years ago, it was better than it would have been a few decades ago, right? And that's actually something we should celebrate. But I think it's also important to distinguish between how stable is the political system and how many people are included under it. In the 50s and 60s, there's a lot of people who were excluded, and there was a crying injustice. But the system as such was stable. I think what we're seeing at the moment is the system itself is becoming deeply unstable because of extreme polarization and partisanship and because of extreme attacks on the most basic rules of liberal democracy coming from Donald Trump and his enablers. And so you can say that you had a chronic disease in the past, but now you're in the midst of an acute heart attack that might kill you, and those are two different kinds of dangers.
Yeah, hi. Kate mentioned earlier, was talking earlier about the checks that the other aspects of government have on the presidency. And you were talking a little bit also about gerrymandering. It seems like to me a lot of time and energy has been spent since at least 2010 on the issues with gerrymandering. Now, of course, that only affects the House, right?
Yeah.
That's a very US-specific question, but it seems like maybe the bigger problem or issue is with the Senate, right? Because the Senate has a lot of responsibilities in terms of their checks on the presidency. And of course, the Senate is maybe more undemocratic than the House in terms of the percentage of the population that chooses the majority there. So I just wanted to have your thoughts on the Senate. And in the short run, obviously, the Senate, how the Senate's being elected is not going to change. And if you had any policy implications, suggestions for those that would like to have these sort of checks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first of all, I'm in general a little skeptical when people think that the solution to the rise of authoritarian populism in the United States is remedies which virtually every other democracy has already put in place, and yet they still experience authoritarian populism, right? So look, gerrymandering is extremely unjust. It's an obvious way in which our system is screwed up. If we fix gerrymandering, which absolutely we should try to do, we're not going to have solved the underlying sets of issues and problems, right? And that's an important thing to understand, because if your prescription to how to treat this disease is medicine that other people have long been taking, and they're still suffering from the same disease, then you're probably barking up the wrong tree. That was a terribly mixed metaphor. Now on the Senate, look, I'm torn on the Senate. I mean, gerrymandering is just a complete dysfunctional political system that was never intended and has no justification. The differential representation of different states does have a justification. And actually, when the system was implemented, Maryland, I think, had about 1/10 of the population that Virginia did. So it's difficult to make an argument that the founders weren't aware of some of the disparities in population that you might have. Now, they didn't have a polarized political system with two very distinct tribes in the kind of way we do now. And so the problem of Maryland having a 10th of a vote perhaps wasn't as deep. They also didn't have, to the extent that we do, the notion that the point of the system really is to translate popular views into public policies. But I think we have to recognize here that two different values are at war with each other. On the one hand, one man, one vote, and the feeling that the voice you have in this country shouldn't depend on whether you happen to live in South Dakota or whether you happen to live in California. And on the other hand, the fact that we are a federal republic and the states do retain a little bit of a separate identity and that is supposed to be reflected in the Senate. So I wonder if a better way of dealing it actually is to recognize that the Senate is going to remain a counter-majoritarian institution, that that's its nature and it's always been its nature and it's not going to change, but to make sure that at least the other branches of government are more majoritarian. I think abolishing the Electoral College, for which there was once a practical need and no longer is a straightforward way of trying to achieve that. Getting rid of gerrymandering will make a contribution to that. And in that case, we can at least avoid the situation we currently have, in which popular majorities have voted for Democrats in the House, in the Senate, and the presidency, and yet all three of those institutions are controlled by Republicans. If it was just the Senate, I think that would be more justifiable.
Over there.
Well, what's wrong with the guy in the purple sweater? He seemed friendly
No, we're
too.
trying to alternate from the two sides.
I know, I'm joking. The microphone had nearly reached him, and then it was wrested away from him.
It's maybe very specific, but how do you see the elections in Brazil, the runoff elections? On the one side, you have Jair Bolsonaro, who I believe you would qualify as a populist. On the other side, you have the party that has ruled Brazil for the last 16 years or so, and it's already very unpopular with parts of the population.
Well, I think that Brazil has a bad choice and a terrible choice, and we're nearly certain to go for the terrible choice.
Thank you.
Now you can go to John.
Oh, you know that guy, I see.
Yeah, that's why I don't get to ask a question right away. Well, I haven't read the book. Let me just start off by that, but that's still not going to stop me from asking the question. But it seems like after your discussion...
I've scared people, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
I promise I won't bite anymore.
But after hearing the discussion, it seems like the problem with democracy is the people, that there's either they're uneducated, either they're not informed, and you need some type of enlightened elite to kind of provide them with some information. And it tends to be a problem when some populist goes out in front and says, oh, I'm one of you, and then is able to kind of control the machinery and then keeps track of the machinery. So it's hard to kind of get this notion of democracy, but with an exception. I think Luigi was coming at this point of this trade-off between kind of your definition of a liberal democracy where individuals can live their life according to how they want to, but yet we want to collectively come to agreements, which means we have to sacrifice some of this individuality for some collective benefit. And it's not clear that ex ante we know what that benefit should be or what that outcome should be. So we end up getting these kind of cycles where eventually, when you talk about populism is on the rise, I see it as just mean reversion. When the dominant form is democratic governments, of course, you're not going to get more democratic. You can only go down.
So there's a lot of different questions in that.
That's why they restricted my question.
Yeah, and I can see the wisdom of it now. No, so look, I don't think the basic characterization of my book is right. I don't think it's a question of elite managing the people or anything like that. In fact, I think that's why I write at length about the failings of what I call undemocratic liberalism, which I think was an attempt to do that. The argument I do make, though, is that one of the acute dangers to our political system right now is a set of people who say, I am the people. That's literally the slogan of many populists around the world. I am the people. I am your voice, as Donald Trump said at the Republican National Convention in 2016. But when you look at what they end up doing in government, they start off with certain policies that may be popular. They often get elected with quite significant popular support, as Bolsonaro is likely to in a couple of weeks. But once they are in government, they dismantle independent checks on the power to such an extent that they turn against democracy. That it's no longer possible to remove them for free and fair elections. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in my book, absolutely, is to warn people about that. To say those people who may be right in some of their analysis, who may be right about some of the elite failings, they are ultimately not going to be your champions. They're not going to return power to the people, as Donald Trump promised in his inaugural address. They would like to take even more power away from you and concentrate it into their own hands. And that's what's happened in Turkey, in Venezuela, in Hungary. So don't be fooled by that.
But those were the same arguments they were making against the other elite, that they protected and insulated themselves, and you need to kind of get them out of control. Like, those arguments aren't clearly populist, they're just opposition party arguments, the same. Like, I'm Cuban, so I tend to know people that talk to the people, and the people tell them in their ear what they want. But that ends to be the same arguments that anybody out of power would make, that the people in power aren't it's not clear to me that this is purely populist. It seems like you could see arguments that I speak for the people. Like, my question is the question that the audience has.
No, I think this is the crucial distinction between seeing your the opposition of the other political parties as adversaries or as enemies, right? So any democratic politician says, look, I think there's all kinds of ways in which the government is screwed up. I think I speak for more people. That's why I'm going to win this election, right? I'm going to fix things. I'm going to improve things for you. I'm going to fight for you in a way that those people don't. Perhaps there's some corruption scandal, and they try to exploit that too. That's all part of normal politics. But they also say, if I lose the election, that's legitimate, and it's okay for those guys to rule for another 4 years, because I'll have another shot at it in 4 years. They also say, you know what? If they stay in power, you don't have to be scared for your life. They're not enemies of your country. They're just wrong on a bunch of things. I will do a better job. And I think that is an important distinction between how politics goes between different candidates. Look at the difference between how Donald Trump ran for president, threatening to lock up his political opponent, casting doubt on whether he would accept the outcome of the election if he won, saying that there was massive fraud even when he did win, and how, for all of his flaws, John McCain ran for president in 2008, in which a few days before the election at a town hall, a woman stood up and basically said, look, Barack Obama is an Arab and he's a bad man, and I'm scared for what he'll do to America. And John McCain said, look, I think you should vote for me. I think I'm going to be a better president. I think it's important that I win. But if Obama wins, you don't have to be scared for your country. He's a decent man. You don't have to be afraid. That's the difference between a populist and a non-populist.
I'd like to invoke the 19th Amendment and see if there's any ladies who would like to participate in this very undemocratic selection process. Yeah? Okay.
I have a very simple question that's been confusing me for the last, 3 years maybe. What is the definition of an elite? Because it's always like, yeah, I had 5 years of Latin and I like to read books, so I'm elitist, but how can somebody who has 10 yachts or something not be an elitist? So what's really the definition of an elite?
I think that's a great question, especially because I think some of the people who, like to see populism in part as the answer rather than the problem, tend to associate themselves with not being the elite. But so I'm not going to give you a technical definition of being an elite, but I'm going to give you what philosophers call a sufficient condition of being a member of the elite. And if we're being honest with ourselves, then anybody who's sufficiently interested in politics, who has sufficient leisure, who has sufficient cultural comfort with coming to the Union Club in Chicago, to go to a lecture organized by the Stigler Center, much less somebody who is a tenured professor at the Booth School and so on, is an elite. And so we're all elites here. I think that, sadly, is the truth. And that's fine, as Luigi introduced me to one of his doctoral students earlier, who was working on the Italian elitist school of political theory. I mean, any society produces elites. There were produced elites in the Soviet Union, there were elites in Venezuela, there are certainly elites, and often very self-dealing ones, in Trumpist America. So the problem is not that there are elites. The question is how we can have mechanisms to ensure that they govern in a way that's actually fair to those people who are not members of the elite. But it starts by recognizing, being honest about the fact that we're all elites. And if we're sort of saying, oh, the elite's over there, but we're not part of it, I don't think we're being honest with ourselves or each other.
I think this is probably the last question.
Yes, I think so.
Do you want to take it, Richard? Thank you for sharing your thoughts tonight. I am Dimitris, a student at Chicago booth, and originally from Greece.
Elite.
So this is very relevant. This is very relevant. So you spoke about the threat of populism to democracy. You made references to the left and to the right on what was implied equivalent terms. This is a notion I do not subscribe to, but I would love to hear your thoughts more about the threat to democracy posed by the radical center and the TINA philosophy. There is no alternative philosophy, which is something that we see play out in Europe for the past 10 years, where at the head of the executive branch, we have the European Commission, which is unelected, does not answer to the people, and makes all the big decisions. So I wonder what your thoughts are about it.
So, look, chapter 1 of my book is called Rights Without Democracy, and precisely speaks about the challenge of what I call undemocratic liberalism, a political system in which we don't do a good enough job of translating popular views into public policies. And that's in part because money plays a huge role in our politics, obviously in the United States, but also in the European Union, where the number of lobbyists in Brussels has gone up from about 500 in the 1970s to about 30,000 today. It's also the case because we have more and more institutions that have taken a lot of important decisions out of the democratic process. So you have independent central banks, you have trade treaties, you have international organizations, you have bureaucratic agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency or Consumer Protection Bureau, some of which, by the way, do very good work, some of which are necessary if you want to make sure that power plants remain safe and all of those kinds of things, but which cumulatively give people the understandable, the right impression that what they say doesn't really matter because a lot of the most important things have already been decided for them. Now, the fact that these institutions often do good work present us with a deep technocratic dilemma, which I don't think people on either side of this divide take seriously. The populists tend to say, just abolish all of this, give all of that power back to the people, and everything's going to be great. And I think that doesn't acknowledge, for example, that to deal with something like climate change, we will have to have 200 nations around the world actually cooperating. And that'll entail international agreements, which obviously will make you and I feel like we don't really have a say in what happens to them. So I don't think just giving power back to the people is a solution, but just saying, oh, some of these institutions do good work, so let's not worry about their legitimacy, is not a solution either. And that's a very deep problem that we have to take seriously. So in a sense, I'm on board with the premise of your question. I also think, though, that we need to distinguish between an insufficiently democratic system in which people for good reason feel like they don't have enough say, and the kind of rapid deterioration of political institutions that you've seen in countries like Hungary and Turkey, as well as, yes, Venezuela, where you have right-wing and left-wing populists coming in, promising to solve all of those problems, and within a relatively span of time, establishing a cruel dictatorship that throws its opponents in prisons if they're lucky and murders them if they're unlucky. And I think to compare the danger of that in any way with whatever deep problems and democratic deficits the European Union might have is just to compare apples with blood oranges.
Luigi and I actually have a former podcast episode. We interviewed Sir Paul Tucker, and that episode was about the danger of independent agencies and unelected bureaucrats. So maybe if you listen to our podcast, we'll read your book.
Sounds good. That sounds like a deal.
And with this, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
And he will sign books over there. So. Thank you. Very good.